Brendon O'Connor, it seems that there was a different mood than 4 years ago, I guess inevitably, in a way. The optimism may not be there. Is there more realism there, do you think?
There was a lot of optimism in the crowd, obviously, in 2009, and Obama in some ways was trying to tone that down with his first inaugural address. He talked about putting childish things behind us and dampening down expectations. In some ways, he's changed from being a great speech maker to another politician in many regards. And the winds at his sails, to some extent at the moment, I think, in relative terms for his presidency. So there was a bit of optimism in the speech. It was a call out to some of the supporting groups, African Americans, gay and lesbians in the speech. So I think there was a sense of, a certain sense of optimism, but a realism about what challenges are ahead, particularly with the Republicans in the Congress.
It seems, Nick, that oftentimes inaugural addresses, Lincoln's second inaugural is literally etched in stone at the Lincoln Memorial. Do you think the stonemasons were getting their chisels ready today?
Oh, look, I think the speech was targeted in a large degree at the historians, because at the end of a second term where he might not accomplish that much, he can point to that second inaugural and said, at least I tried. At least I tried on climate change. At least I tried on gay rights. I might not achieve that much, but there's the record. At least I tried. And what struck me about the speech overall was it looked like an inaugural, it sounded like an inaugural, but in many ways the content sounded like something you'd hear at a private fundraiser on the West Coast in Hollywood. The evocation of Selma, the evocation of Stonewall. It was very much a speech targeted at Obama's coalition and Obama's America. And I was struck again by the difference with his breakthrough speech back in 2004 at the convention in Boston, when he was talking about, we don't want a red states America, we don't want a blue states America, we want a United States America. This was far more partisan. This was about Obama's America.
Sarah James, was this a call to arms, do you think, for Liberals who are maybe a little bit disappointed with Obama?
Oh, I think this was a very shrewd inaugural address. And the reason I think that is because I think that President Obama tried hard to work with the Republicans in his first administration, and that didn't go so well. So I think this time what he's trying to do is really the only thing American presidents can do, which is to call for leadership and to say that they're leading and just to wait to see if everybody gets in line and follows. That's really what the public opinion means. If he can get his people on side and get the court of public opinion behind him, then he has a chance to work with Congress. But he learned to, he was chastened after his first administration when he learned that he couldn't just have good rhetoric and get Capitol Hill to work with him. So this time I think he's reaching out to the broader America and trying to get his agenda passed that way.
All right, well, we're going to talk some more about some of the specifics, but you were one of those chairs who really sort of saw this as being quite remarkable in that he was repositioning himself from the centrist of last year's campaign into a whole new Barack Obama.
Yeah, I was really surprised, actually, just how much to the left it was. Just as you said, just going down the laundry list of left-wing interest groups. And I wasn't expecting that at an inauguration. But we'll be talking more about this coming up. So let's not blow our load now, John.
Yeah, exactly. Well, of course, one of the major themes of this inaugural address was a call for unity. But, of course, it did come with that shopping list of potentially very divisive progressive causes.
It did. I mean, there were echoes of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King throughout the speech, but what I found interesting was Obama actually sought to wrap his agenda with the legacy of the slain civil rights leader on Martin Luther King Day, which was a very interesting tactic.
This generation of Americans has been tested by crises that steeled our resolve and proved our resilience. A decade of war is now ending. An economic recovery has begun. America's possibilities are limitless, for we possess all the qualities that this world without boundaries demands: youth and drive, diversity and openness, an endless capacity for risk, and a gift for reinvention. My fellow Americans, we are made for this moment, and we will seize it so long as we seize it together.
I'll start with you.
For we, the people, Understand that our country cannot succeed when a shrinking few do very well and a growing many barely make it. We believe that America's prosperity must rest upon the broad shoulders of a rising middle class.
Nick, something I was struck by 4 years ago when Barack Obama was first running, he said, unlike Bill Clinton, he stirred some feathers, he said, unlike Bill Clinton, I want to be like Ronald Reagan, who was a transformational president, who actually changed the narrative. And a lot of people wondered where that person went for the last 4 years. I was listening to this speech and I was hearing him talk about unity, unity, unity. But in terms of unity is often a conservative value. But talking about in terms of liberal items like gay rights, etc., talking about that as unity. And I wondered, is this the transformational president starting to poke his head out? Do you think that's what he was going for?
Well, I hate to use the term the real Obama, but I sense that we heard a bit of that today. And the embrace of Martin Luther King was very instrumental in that, I think. 4 years ago, when he made his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention at the Mile High Stadium in Denver, it was the 45th anniversary of the Great March on Washington, where Martin Luther King delivered that wondrous sermon, the I Have a Dream speech. And rather than actually refer to Martin Luther King by name, he referred to him rather obliquely as a young preacher from Georgia. And it spoke of this reluctance to embrace the kind of racial meaning of his candidacy. He always let others attach racial meaning to his candidacy, but he was kind of reluctant to do it himself for obvious reasons, because of the difficulties of a black man getting elected. It's clear that he's far more willing now to speak about his blackness. It's clear now he's far more willing to speak openly about his support for gay people in America. And I sense that a lot of the things he suppressed for kind of electoral reasons, for political reasons for the last 4 years, he's thinking now, it's my second term, let's go for it.
So, Brendon, if you agree with that analysis, I'm not sure if you do, but if you do you think this is the beginning of a lot more of this kind of talk, or do you think this is something that happened on Inauguration Day and we'll just get back to talking about the deficit for the next 4 years?
Well, I think his response on gun reform is reflective of this. He's freed up. He's never going to be up for re-election again. I don't even know if he want to campaign for others the way he campaigned in some ways. He was sick of it. And so I think he enjoys the role of governing. I think there's a sense that he is freed up, that he's going to show his hand a little more, expend more political capital on issues like gun reform, on global warming, which is a good thing in many regards. I mean, these are big problems that America faces. So I think it will be exciting to watch in the months ahead. The Republicans, I think, are at a weak moment, so he's got a brief moment of opportunity.
On that note, Sarah, can I ask, how do you think Republicans would react to this? We've been talking about the Democrats and Barack Obama's interest groups, but how will the other half of the country respond to this new direction?
Well, it's interesting that you say the other half, because that's about what the polls say, that about 50% of the U.S. population agrees with Obama, which means that about 50% does not. So there's real division. What typically happens in the U.S. is that the first, say, 100 days of the term, the president is allowed to go forth with his agenda. And those are really crucial days. So I think you'll see the Republicans being quiet for the next little while. And then as we get to the State of the Union, which is just around the corner in early February, then you may see some cracks starting to happen. But what's super important is that while this term is for 4 years, the first 2 years are crucial. After that, the term lame duck comes into play, and really we start to think about who's going to be the next president. So what I saw today was a very feisty President Obama who's ready to get going. And I think the Republicans are wary of that. They know they've got to work with him to deal with the debt and the financial mess, but they're going to be waiting for their turn to kind of step out and say what it is they want to do.
Nick, what did you make of the layers of history that we're operating today? We talked about Martin Luther King. Lincoln, of course, was the other figure who's never sort of far from Obama's rhetoric, and we understand his thinking as well in how he assembled his government and how he perhaps hopes to lead America out of a period of deep division into a more peaceful time. You know, there's a really interesting interaction there, given that Martin Luther King was around at the time of the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, 50 years on now. I mean, there's a symmetry to it, but does it go further?
I'm always struck at American inaugurals at the rich rhetorical heritage that presidents can draw from. It doesn't happen here. There isn't that same kind of rhetorical richness, and it's the same. It's
Still
true.
the McMahon.
It's the same. It's true in Britain as well, and the language is very highfalutin, isn't it? It's biblical almost. The lash and you get words that don't often get used in normal speak, in kind of inaugural speak. It's a kind of different way of speaking. I go back to this idea that I was just struck by the combative tone of it and the difference between his initial approach, which was all about rapprochement with the Republicans and rapprochement with the American right, and now really sticking it to them in this speech. I mean, this was a very aggressive inaugural speech and would have been very difficult for the Republican leaders to deal with. And as Sarah says, I mean, he knows that he's just got 2 years. I mean, if you look ahead to the midterms, the Democrats in the Senate are defending more vulnerable seats than the Republicans. He's probably going to be dealing with an even more hostile Congress at the end of his second term. So I was struck by how combative it was.
Nick, would you be guessing that this is Obama just following a new tactic that he devised on his own or his advisors or whatever, or it's just him taking advantage of the fact that Republicans are really not very popular at the moment?
Well, I think that's right. He's always calling the Republicans bluff. He's saying you're on the wrong side of demography at the moment. You've got a huge problem with the biggest, fastest growing part of the electorate, which is the Hispanic vote. People think you're the nasty party. I want a pretty decisive victory here. You only got 47% of the vote. So I'm on the winning side of history here. So, I mean, he's sort of almost challenged them to reform themselves. Now, the question is, will they? I mean, liberal overreach is something that the Republicans are always looking for. It's the way they've often got back into the game, certainly in midterm elections in Congress. And, they'll be thinking, well, this guy's sounding really liberal. The American public won't buy that 2 years' time. We'll be really back in the game.
Brendon, Republicans already saying, well, the President may have a mandate, but so do we. We've got the numbers in the House still, and we're not going to be a rubber stamp. We're still going to try and be a check and a balance on what we see as the excesses of a President who's out of step with America. Is this just a formula for more partisanship?
I find this hard to say, but I'm in a bit of an election junkie. So 2014, I think, will be fascinating. I mean, it may justify another 2 years on the air for Planet America.
Keep talking, Brendon.
This Republican majority in the House of Representatives will be something the Democrats will want to go after. Pelosi can't be majority leader for that much longer and hold her position. So I think that 2014 election, if the demographics are on the Democratic side, they've got to turn out for midterms, some of these people as well. They've been OK at turning out for presidential elections, the young voter, the Hispanic voter, a lot of African Americans, but can they turn out for a midterm?
And they usually don't, do they?
Not in the past. So I think there is potential for the last 2 years to be pretty exciting of the Obama presidency if the Democrats were able to win the House of Representatives. I mean, that's a big if, and hold the Senate. So I don't think it's entirely just a sort of 100-day game or a 2-year game Obama's got to play here. I think it's got to be a 4-year game.
I should say, by the way, that I've seen a lot of analyses about the way the House is structured when it comes to electoral boundaries, etc. And the Democrats are going to need to win by 6 or 7% to take the House. So that'll take some doing.
Talking about electoral calculations, I think the speech revealed another one, which is that Democrats, like Obama, don't have to worry so much anymore about culturally conservative whites. Before Obama, every single Democrat, going back to Kennedy, had been from the South because it was believed that Southern Democrats could speak to culturally conservative whites in a way that Northern progressives didn't. And Obama very much toned down his whole approach in 2008 to appeal to the sort of culturally conservative whites. That calculation seems to have changed now because he knows he can assemble a coalition, a winning coalition in presidential politics that doesn't need culturally conservative whites. And that's a major reshift in American politics.
Now, we're going to talk some more shortly about what the next 2 to 4 years, depending on at what point the duck starts limping shortly. But first, let's have a look at some more at some of the history behind today's events. While presidential inaugurations are certainly historic and the words spoken are sometimes etched in marble, but more often than not, they're actually forgotten rather quickly.
Well, sometimes they're not. Sometimes swearing-in ceremonies are very memorable, but for all the wrong reasons.
America's first president, General George Washington, took the oath of office on the 30th of April 1789 on the balcony of the New York Federal Hall. He then headed into the Senate chamber to give the first ever inaugural address. General Washington sounded almost unwilling as he said the voice of the American public had called him to serve. 4 years later, he was sworn in for a second term, this time in Philadelphia, and then he gave the shortest ever inaugural address, just 135 words. The longest ever address came from President William Henry Harrison in 1841. At the age of 68, he was the oldest president to take office until Ronald Reagan came along 140 years later. Harrison wanted to show his youthful vigour by making his speech on the steps of the Capitol building without a heavy overcoat on what was a bitterly cold and wet day in Washington, D.C. As the freezing rain tumbled down, it took President Harrison almost 2 hours to read his 8,000-word speech. 31 days later, he died of pneumonia. In Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address in 1861, he warned the southern states against secession as civil war loomed. They didn't listen. In 1925, Calvin Coolidge became the first president to have his inaugural address broadcast on the wireless. Despite his nickname of Silent Cal, they could hear him rather well. And the first president to take the oath of office on television was Harry Truman in 1949. But probably the most famous quote from any inaugural address came from Franklin Roosevelt at the height of the Great Depression.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And then, of course, there was John F. Kennedy at the height of the Cold War in 1961.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
4 years ago, Barack Obama's swearing in using Abraham Lincoln's old Bible was flubbed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully.
That I will execute
the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States faithfully.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Just to be sure, President Obama was sworn in again the next day at the White House. And this year, because the inauguration day, the 20th of January, fell on a Sunday and the public ceremony was on a Monday, Barack Obama became the first president since Franklin Roosevelt to be sworn in a total of 4 times. The President of the United States is also, of course, the Commander-in-Chief of the largest military force anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and despite the fact that drone attacks were continuing in the Middle East today, Obama's emphasis today was very much on democracy and peace.
America will remain the anchor of strong alliances in every corner of the globe. And we will renew those institutions that extend our capacity to manage crisis abroad. For no one has a greater stake in a peaceful world than its most powerful nation. We will support democracy from Asia to Africa, from the Americas to the Middle East, because our interests and our conscience compel us to act on behalf of those who long for freedom.
Sarah James, what did you make of that? Should we read much into the fact that Asia was mentioned first there and the Middle East last? Is that just speechcraft, or is that actually foreign policy priorities?
Oh, it's very interesting. I think one of the things that you have to watch in any speech like this is that there is nothing accidental. So I do think you need to pay attention to that. But, you know, I think that said, it's very clear that the mood in the United States is to, while being vigilant and watching all sectors of the globe, to try to be drawing troops back, bringing troops home, bringing down Afghanistan, and so on. So I think that you're seeing an America very different from the United States 4 years ago, when our economy was in shambles. It's now improving slowly. When we were in 2 different, major wars, and now that's starting to change. And so I think that's different. In fact, one of the things I think is interesting is one aspect that just popped to the top of the agenda wasn't an international crisis, but one involving guns at home. And that's, of course, what happened at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And now that's given a new impetus for President Obama to tackle gun control in America. And that's been very divisive, kind of a third rail that nobody wanted to touch. And now they're taking it on.
The timing, of course, Brendon O'Connor, the President didn't choose to have the debate at all in his first term when he could have, and suddenly it happens after he's re-elected. Is this a moment? Could the political stars align after Sandy Hook to get something done on that front?
There is a bit of a Port Arthur feel about it, the sense of enough is enough. I mean, 6 months ago, that cinema shooting in Colorado, there's a very mealy-mouthed response from Obama. It's a tragedy, it's a human tragedy, but there wasn't much policy put forward. So I think that is a very different tone.
Brendon, can you actually see the Congress, enough Republicans voting to tamp down guns in any way for something to actually happen?
I think that would be incredibly difficult. I mean, but reform occurred in the 1990s. I mean, the Brady Bill, the assault weapons bill in the middle of the 1990s. So I think there can be a lot of pressure put on certain Republicans. I mean, this will be a seat-by-seat campaign with an eye to the next election in some regards. So I don't think Obama is completely at a dead loss here. Background checks, those could be improved, I think, by executive orders a lot more than they are. I mean, 40% of people buying guns without a background check sounds, terrible.
When it comes to America's foreign policy, Nick, we know that John Kerry is almost certain to be replacing Hillary Clinton, once confirmed. Almost certain as well, Chuck Hagel moving into defence. But those confirmations, Republicans are threatening to possibly keep them on hold until they get some more answers about what actually happened at the US consulate in Benghazi last year. The fact that even foreign policy now has become a part of the partisan rancor, what clues are there for you in how Obama is going to approach that topic broadly in a second term?
Well, he faces a number of big challenges. The relationship with China is a huge challenge for him, and Iran on the brink of a nuclear capability. That's another huge challenge for him. And what happens in Israel over the next few days? If Netanyahu is returned with a big mandate, which it looks like he will be, then, what happens to the two-state solution, which has been the basis of American policy in the Middle East since Clinton? So, I mean, those three are going to be tricky. I think in terms of foreign policy as well, it's going to be seen as more of a part of economic policy. I think that's something that Obama will be focusing on this time round, and that raises the problem of the Eurozone. It's not a particularly sexy foreign policy issue. It's not about peace in the Middle East. It's not about fighting wars. But actually, in terms of tangible effects for everyday Americans, what happens in the Eurozone over the next 4 years is going to be crucially important. And there's talk of the possibility of some kind of free trade agreement with the EU, something like that. But I think foreign policy increasingly, now that Iraq and Afghanistan are sort of receding in importance, is going to be more of as much an economic policy as much as a foreign policy.
Sarah, we're seeing in the past, often when there's a withdrawal from an engagement, it's a great excuse to trim down the military and pocket the money and reduce the deficit. Obviously, at the moment, they're talking a lot about the deficit. Could you see Obama doing exactly that with Afghanistan and Iraq and just pocketing the money and as a means to reduce the debt? Or do you think he could use that money to increase engagements elsewhere?
Well, they're going to have to pocket a lot of money to answer the debt, and I think they're going to have to pull it from a lot of pockets. I think everything is going to be on the table, and I think certainly that, you're going to absolutely look at some of those numbers as being a way that they're going to want to pull some of that money from every place, and the military is not exempt. That said, I think, it's important to put this in context, and one of the things I would say is that there is real fatigue in the United States with the military situation, with having to spend so much on military engagements overseas. So I think that he's going to, on the one hand, have that. On the other hand, have the concern that's kind of a traditional concern that we want to feel, that Americans want to feel that they have a strong enough military that any need internationally can be met. And traditionally, that makes it difficult to cut military budgets by so much. So, there's the realpolitik in addition to trying to find the money from a variety of different sources. And of course, taxes are also going to be considered. And so I think it's going to have to come from a variety of sources because the numbers, 16 trillion, eek, These are big numbers that we're talking about. You know, not in my piggy bank, not in anybody's piggy bank.
Well, there was certainly a sense in President Obama's speech today that the job is not yet done, that there is plenty of work to do, whether it's the debt and the deficit, gay marriage, the gun debate, they all rated a big mention.
Yeah.
For our journey is not complete until our wives, our mothers and daughters can earn a living equal to their efforts. Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law. For if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well. Our journey is not complete until no citizen is forced to wait for hours to exercise the right to vote. Our journey is not complete until we find a better way to welcome the striving, hopeful immigrants who still see America as a land of opportunity, until bright young students and engineers are enlisted in our workforce rather than expelled from our country. Our journey is not complete until all our children, from the streets of Detroit to the hills of Appalachia to the quiet lanes of Newtown, know that they are cared for and cherished and always safe from harm.
Big moment there, like we were talking before, Barack Obama on the offense, co-opting Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. But I know I'm a broken record about this, but for ordinary people in the streets, it's always about the economy.
I think he's going to do even better as far as trying to get the Republicans and Democrats to agree on things.
I hope the economy gets better. I hope the economy gets better the next month. A lot of people where we live are really suffering, so I hope the economy gets better.
I would like to see him work on the economic issues as well as trying to get just more social issues taken care of, working for the kids and working for the elderly.
In the next 4 years, I hope that people on both sides of the aisle will really learn to compromise. You know, it's not about what's best for a political party, you know, whether it be Democrat or Republican. I'd like to see them make decisions that's really what's best for the country.
Okay, so people are talking about the economy. Sure. They always do. We've been hearing all during the campaign, we heard economists say whoever wins this next election is going to be doing pretty well, Brendon O'Connor, because the recovery is coming. Is the recovery here? Are we seeing the green shoots?
Slowly, and at risk from political actors in the Congress. You know, this debt debate may have been delayed for 2 or so months, but the political game can sort of set the economy back onto a kind of recession path. Growth, I think, is probably pretty shaky in the United States at the moment. It's certainly not guaranteed. And unemployment will be, I think, the issue that really will be focused on in this first year by Obama. It's still only just under 8%. That's not particularly healthy. So I think, you know, the economy will be his first concern. He talked a lot about inequality in this speech today, which is, you know, something he's talked a little bit about in his State of the Union addresses. What he's actually doing on inequality, I'm not so sure. There's not a lot of progress on that front in the first 4 years.
I'm not sure a lot of people know what to do about that. It's a pretty big issue.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he hasn't had his way in the Congress. He wasn't able to get the tax cuts, the tax increases that he wanted. But I still think that he hasn't really got a very strong legacy on this front of reducing inequality in the United States, and I think that's something he's talked about for a long time as a politician, and it's interesting that his legacy isn't, you know, to this point, you know, he hasn't had the best conditions, but it isn't particularly strong on that issue.
On the fiscal cliff that we were talking about last December, Nick, and it seems we've gone straight from averting the fiscal cliff or just going over it, but then scurrying back onto the top of it the next day, and now suddenly they're talking about the debt ceiling again within a couple of months. Were there any clues in how that played out? As Brendon said, the tax increases for the rich, Obama didn't get all his own way there. He did have to compromise. So what does it tell us?
Oh, from the language of the speech, it sounded like he's going to stick it to the Republicans and really put the ball in their court. I'm going to make the case. I've got this bully pulpit. I've got what amounts to a mandate. Not that they're very respected these days in American politics on either side. And I'm going to make the case and come up against me, and let's see who wins this one. I mean, again, the language wasn't language of compromise. It was aggressive language. I mean, McCain's come out today and said it was a fine speech, but I didn't see an olive branch. I didn't hear any conciliatory speak from the president. So, I mean, he's battling, and he thinks at the moment he's got the edge. I mean, he sort of won the fiscal cliff battle, and he thinks he can win the debt ceiling battle. But, you know, whether he can or not, with Mitch McConnell and the Republican leadership in the House, I mean, it's going to be very tricky.
Sarah James, you talked about the $16 trillion debt. Is that what is holding the United States back from economic recovery, or is it the political uncertainty because they can't decide how to deal with that is actually stopping businesses from hiring people at that grassroots level?
You know, that is a really interesting question. How about this as a little nugget? Warren Buffett, you know, one of the most respected, brilliant minds when it comes to financial matters and making lots of money, said the biggest risk isn't the debt. It is Congress and the inability of everybody to get along. So it was really interesting, this kind of slap in the face to Congress saying, you guys have to work together. The president can't force Congress. He has to encourage. And I think the lesson for President Obama from his first term was that it didn't go so well when he tried to be conciliatory. And now I do think he's coming in a little tougher with a little bit more swagger to see if maybe that works a little bit better. And he's trying to do it in the early days when he did have the mandate from winning and he's got his best chance. Whether or not it's going to work, it's hard to say. I mean, to talk about the taxes and the increase in taxes on people who are considered rich, well, that definition changed. Rich people went from having $250,000 to having $400,000. So there is compromise going on here. What is rich? How do we get compromise? It's going to be tricky. But I think that the American public is sick to death of Capitol Hill and the White House not talking to each other when they happen to be really close geographically. They need to figure it out.
Sarah, you talked about how Obama's been a bit more aggressive with Congress now, and whether it will work or not remains to be seen. Well, we actually just saw just now with the debt ceiling fight, just now the Republicans have put it off 3 months. As I said before, they're going to pull the trigger potentially on the debt ceiling issue. Now, people said that you shouldn't antagonise them because that's their biggest leverage. They could make the economy go under. And Obama did antagonise them, and they caved. They caved for 3 months. So do you think it worked, or do you think this is just putting off a bigger fight somewhere down the track?
Well, there's two things. I think there's some stalling going on. If you put it off for 3 months, who knows what things are going to be like then. But I do think that there is real soul-searching going on within the Republican Party. Not everybody, I'm not saying everybody, but many Republicans thought that they should have won this election, that there was a president in office, a Democratic president in office who was battered and bruised, and that they should have been able to win, given what the polls were saying, and they lost. So I think that the Republicans are fighting a two-front war. One is figuring out what happened, and secondly, how much do we need to give, and how much do we need to cooperate? And you know, some are more cooperative than others, that's for certain. But I think that the position that President Obama is taking is that while I want to bring everybody together, I'm going to respond to my core. And that's who you're going to hear President Obama talking about this time. And we'll see how that works out.
Yeah, we sure will. Well, naturally, perhaps for any second-term president, Barack Obama also seems to be thinking right now a lot about his legacy and what his generation will leave behind for the next.
Yeah, although climate change was pretty much ignored during the election campaign, that was not the case today.
We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations. Some may still deny the overwhelming judgment of science, but none can avoid the devastating impact of raging fires and crippling drought and more powerful storms. The path towards sustainable energy sources will be long and sometimes difficult. But America cannot resist this transition. We must lead it. We cannot cede to other nations the technology that will power new jobs and new industries. We must claim its promise. That's how we will maintain our economic vitality and our national treasure. Our forests and waterways, our croplands and snow-capped peaks. That is how we will preserve our planet, commanded to our care by God.
Nick, I was really surprised by this. This was the bit which I was most surprised by during the speech. He spent so long talking about climate change. Back in 2008, he talked a lot about climate change. Then in 2009, he tried to pass some legislation, and it stalled, not just because of Republicans, but because of Democrats. Even when he could pass healthcare, he couldn't pass climate change. In 2009, at the peak of his powers, does he have any chance of passing climate change legislation over the next 4 years?
I don't think he does. And I think, again, the point I made earlier, this was a speech for the historians. This was a speech that in 30 years' time, when his daughters or his grandkids come up to him and say, Dad, Grandpa, what did you do about climate change? He said, well, look at the inaugural. Look at the second inaugural. I spoke about it, but Congress stopped me from doing it. And I think there's a very strong element of that. What struck me about the climate change stuff was it was very similar to an editorial that was written by David Remnick in The New Yorker immediately after the election, which he basically said, you know, the big issue of this second term should be climate change. And again, it was a speech for New Yorker lovers, wasn't it? It was a speech for the west coast of America, but it was a speech on climate change I don't think translates into substantive achievement in the second term because Congress is going to block it.
Sarah James, do you share Nick's scepticism here? Do you think in 2.5 weeks when the State of the Union comes along, climate change? What climate change?
No, I think we might hear it in the State of the Union. I'll be interested to see, but I think we very well could. I mean, you know, interestingly, Mayor Bloomberg in New York kind of hesitated as to who he was going to support. He's a Republican, but he's a very leftist-center Republican and, you know, again, mayor of New York. And at the end, he, after the huge storm that swept through New York, he said, you know, I'm going for President Obama. And it's because of climate change. So I think that there are definite forces, West Coast, East Coast, and growing concern and really people being disconcerted across the U.S. But the actual political will to make things happen, boy, that's tough. And so whether or not it remains to be just spoken about and actually acted upon, that really we're going to have to see.
What do you think, Brendon, if we're talking about Obama's legacy now, what he wants to get done before it's, you know, he's no longer president, he can no longer get much done at all. If he can't get something like climate change done, is it going to be another thorny issue like gun control? Is it going to be something else that we haven't talked about?
I think the unexpected, the unknown is probably likely to shape his second term. I mean, that's the way of politics. We can't really predict what will happen in, you know, a year's time. But I think it is interesting that he's come back to these social issues. He's come back to climate change, things that did rally a lot of enthusiasm for him, a lot of younger voters. And so I think, you know, there'll be a sense of him pushing for more renewable energy. And that really is, I think, something you don't require the Congress to be entirely on side with.
And one thing we should mention before we go, we kind of dropped the ball in this regard, but immigration. Definitely a big issue over the next year. It's going to be all about immigration. Let's not forget that.
Absolutely. We'll have plenty of time to talk about it on Planet America in 2013. That
Never
is
enough time.
All for this program. Thanks to our panel, Brendon O'Connor, Nick Bryant and Sarah James.